Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back to more Conversations in the Digital Age. With us is Richard Haass, President of the Council on Foreign Relations, who was Senior Middle East Advisor to President George H.W. Bush. Richard has written an important but unsettling book which has captured national and international attention. Entitled A World in Disarray, the best-selling work takes a dispassionate look at what the author sees as a global trend of declining world order, and a world that in the 21st century will prove extremely difficult to manage. Giving the book a rave review, Michiko Kakutani in the New York Times says this volume is a valuable primer that concerns citizens of all political persuasions, not to mention the president and his advisors could benefit from reading. Richard, it's my pleasure to welcome you back to the program.
Great to be back, Jim.
Well, first, congratulations on the book and its brilliant success.
Thank you, sir.
In the book, you see a trend of declining order. What do you mean by declining order?
Well, order is about, to the extent to which rules in the international system are agreed upon by the major powers or those who could upset peace, stability, and where they don't agree, there's enough of a balance of power that those who might be tempted to use force to create realities are either dissuaded from doing so or fail if they try. So that's what order is. The reason I think it's declining is I looked at where we were 25 years ago when the Berlin Wall came down, the Cold War ended. I looked at the state of play in the world then. I looked at the optimism. And I simply contrasted it with where we are now. The Middle East, by any and every measure, has significantly unraveled. There's more fault lines than you and I could count. Europe went from being what was the most stable, predictable, almost staid part of the world 5 years ago. Now we've seen Russian aggression, Brexit, massive refugee flows, financial crisis, so the entire European project that was born after World War II is in doubt. Asia, we've got not just the systemic challenge of a rising, powerful China, but we have the more immediate challenge of a reckless, dangerous North Korea, armed with nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. And then we've got also an array of global challenges, takes things like cyber, where you've got powerful technologies, any number of people who can act in that space, but very few rules and no enforcement mechanism. So you add all that up, and I think the case for disarray, unfortunately, is obvious.
Now, you wrote the book before the election. You didn't know who was going to win.
Right.
And would you have seen the same disarray had Hillary Clinton captured the White House? With
one exception, yes. You can choose anything when you run for president, your running mate, your policies, what have you. The only thing you can't choose is your inbox. So when I wrote this book, I didn't know if it was going to be Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump. Indeed, when I began the book, I didn't know it could have been Bernie Sanders or any one of a dozen Republicans. I just knew this was going to be the inbox that would greet the 45th President of the United States. Where I think it's a little bit different between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump is Donald Trump added to the inbox. He added to the degree of disarray by things he said during the campaign, things he said and did during the transition, things he has said and done in the first, 6 weeks or so of his presidency. Or to put it another way, Hillary Clinton represented a much more traditional national security candidate. If I'm allowed to use a football analogy on your show, she was squarely, say, near midfield, whether on the 40-yard line of either side we could debate. Donald Trump is not within the 40-yard lines. On many foreign policy issues, he's maybe the 20, 10, or even in an end zone. So he represents something very different, and he's therefore added to the disarray because he's introduced a whole new layer or level of uncertainty about whether the United States is going to continue to be the sort of great power that it has been now for 3/4 of a century.
Now, in the book, you use the phrase iatrogenic disorder. Iatrogenic is a medical term, I think, when the doctor makes the patient worse.
It is.
They take an oath to Hippocrates that they're not going to do that, but sometimes it happens. Do you see an iatrogenic disorder in what Trump has said and done?
Well, actually, you're exactly right in the use of the phrase. It's treatment-induced illness, and that's what it's the reason sick people should stay out of hospitals. And in this case, what I said is so often what the United States does in the name of promoting its national security can detract from it. And I had in mind, for example, the 2003 Iraq War, which I thought was a decision that made the situation in the region worse, or several things that Barack Obama did or didn't do when he was president. Often what he didn't do in places like Syria, but things that he did, for example, taking U.S. forces out of Iraq after Iraq had been largely restabilized. So sure, I mean, one of the reasons the world is a world of disarray is not simply for large historic forces like globalization, rising powers and the like, but American foreign policy bears more than a little responsibility. And again, it's this combination of what I would call acts of commission and omission, many of which were, to use the phrase you just mentioned, iatrogenic, things we did that took difficult situations and actually made them even more difficult.
Of course, in 2003, you left the government over the issue of going into Iraq. And I think you're critical of the Obama administration in many respects, particularly the red line in Syria. Mm-hmm. Those are examples of iatrogenic disorder.
Absolutely, and just to show I'm an equal opportunity critic, I've also been critical of some of the things that Mr. Trump has said when he's introduced, again, uncertainty, whether about China policy, or what the demise of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. One of the first decisions he made as president was to pull the plug on this trade agreement that had been negotiated with a dozen countries, representing nearly half the world's GDP. And I thought this was economically a mistake. It'll detract from American GDP. It'll detract from world levels of growth. But even more strategically, again, it introduced a new level of uncertainty. And so many countries, particularly allies and friends, as you know, they get up in the morning and they gauge their behavior by expectations that essentially the United States is going to be there for them. They don't have to do everything for themselves because they know they can count on the United States. The nuclear shield is there. America's going to be there economically for them. It's going to be there for conventional military forces. And if we create a world where suddenly they can no longer have that reasonable expectation, they're going to begin to diversify their portfolios. And that might mean either deferring to powerful local states, China in Asia, Russia in Europe, and Iran in the Middle East. Or they may simply say, wow, if we can't depend on the United States, we've got to start taking matters more into our own hands. And one of the great benefits of America's world leadership over the last 70, 75 years is any number of countries that could have developed nuclear weapons, including countries like, say, a South Korea or Japan, decided not to. They didn't need to because they knew they could trust us. If we start to raise fundamental doubts about American reliability, guess what? We're going to gradually see the erosion of not just the norm, but the reality that countries don't need to have their own nuclear weapons.
So the key element is reliability. And if I were to tell you that NATO is obsolete, and then 2 months later tell you that I supported NATO, you might take those inconsistent statements as a basis for not trusting what I said.
There's that, and it's created real questions about who speaks for this administration. You recently had a situation where several of the chief people in the administration, the Vice President, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, were going around Europe, and they were saying quite traditional things about American support for NATO, American support for the EU. At the same time, the President or the Chief Strategist, Steve Bannon, were saying things to journalists and diplomats that were just the opposite. So it's impossible for the lieutenants of the President to reassure if the President and his inner circle at the White House are sending out very different signals. It also has another potential problem, Jim. Just imagine there's a crisis, and there'll be any number. Every president faces foreign policy crises. And just say the President has to go on television and say, hey, trust me, world. We have now intelligence that North Korea is doing this, or Russia's doing that, or is about to do that. And as a result, I have ordered the following steps. What if the world says, well, why should we trust you? Why should we begin to trust you now? Either because you've misrepresented things, you've exaggerated things, you've contradicted yourself. So, the currency of a president's word is extraordinarily valuable. Indeed, you could argue it's invaluable. And I think this president has got to be extremely careful that he doesn't devalue that currency.
Well, then you disagree with Henry Kissinger, who said that Trump's unpredictability is really an asset to the United States.
I do not think unpredictability is an asset. It's certainly not with friends and allies. Vis-a-vis our foes, I'm prepared to say yes on occasion. Uncertainty can be a form of deterrence. If people don't know that you won't do certain things, they might be cautious. On the other hand, I tend to prefer deterrence by certainty. I want Russia to know if it crosses certain lines, the United States is going to respond. I want Syria to know that if it uses chemical weapons, the United States is going to respond. I want North Korea to know that if it puts nuclear weapons on ballistic missiles that can reach the continental United States, that would be an intolerable, unacceptable situation. Now, they may not know exactly how it is we would respond, the when, the where, the how, but I want them to know if they were to take certain steps, they would be putting their existence and their own national interests at risk. I would prefer that message to be one of certainty rather than uncertainty.
Now, the president made a speech recently to Congress. He didn't mention Russia once. He didn't mention China. He didn't mention North Korea. And these might be three of the leading priorities in foreign policy facing a new president, in the inbox, as you put it.
You're exactly right.
He did talk about trade. He said he was for protectionism, and because Abraham Lincoln was. But he really steered clear of these issues you seem to feel are so vital.
90% of his de facto State of the Union speech was about domestic issues. Very little about foreign policy. One reason is there's not a lot of foreign policy professionals to turn to yet. You really can't speak about a State Department. Here we are, it's now March, and you've got a Secretary of State and nobody else. Here it is, it's now.
You said he's home alone.
He's the Macaulay Culkin of foreign policy.
And you've also said that there can't be a lot of daylight between the president and the Secretary of State. If the Secretary of State is going to speak for the president and for the nation in international affairs. And look what's happened. He turned down his choice, whether you like him or not, for a deputy secretary. He's trimmed the appropriation for the State Department. And he seems to contradict him whenever the occasion arises.
Well, it's been a rough start for Rex Tillerson, who's a very experienced worldly man, but who didn't have foreign policy or governing experience. He hasn't been able to put into place his own staff. Indeed, it'll be 6 months if he started tomorrow before he would have most of his staff in place, given the need for people to get security clearances, to get through the hurdle of Senate confirmation, then for these people to get up to speed. The budget that is reportedly being presented to Congress decimates spending on diplomacy, on foreign aid, on development. So it's a real, I think it makes it very difficult for the Secretary of State to succeed. And exactly right. Presidents, in some ways, are the most critical variable about the effectiveness of a Secretary of State. One of the many reasons that Jim Baker, 41 Secretary of State, was so effective is people knew they were incredibly tight. They were friends for decades. And when then Jim Baker spoke, he spoke with the full authority and backing of George Herbert Walker Bush. Other Secretaries of State, shall we say, have not had that luxury. And people got the sense that maybe they could dismiss them or discount what they said because it wasn't clear whether they were freelancing or really representing the White House. Rex Tillerson can only succeed if Donald Trump speaks for him. The same thing I would say for the Secretary of Defense, General Mattis. The same thing for the new National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster. It's got to be clear that he has regular, frequent access to the president and that he is running the only national security decision-making system in the White House. There can't be a separate and parallel one run by Steve Bannon. There can't be a separate and parallel one run by Jared Kushner. All of those have to be funneled through what it is the National Security Advisor is doing, or this president cannot succeed.
But McMaster said, for example, that the phrase Islamic terrorism, radical Islamic terrorism, was not a felicitous choice of words, and that he preferred something else. And then Trump, in his speech, reiterated radical Islamic terrorism as he did in his inaugural address.
But nobody bats 1,000 in government. You don't expect to get your way all the time. So there's going to be, the National Security Advisor wears two hats. The most important hat is he coordinates. He's the traffic cop. He's there to tee up decisions, make sure there's high quality decisions, oversee implementation. That's his most important hat. Secondly, yes, he's an independent counselor or advisor. In this case, his advice was not taken. That to me is not a big deal. You prefer when those things are not, read in the press the next day. But nobody in government gets his way all the time, so that doesn't bother me. The real question, again, is whether he runs, at the end of the day, what is the only national security decision-making system. Other people can plug into it, but they can't run parallel competing systems. We can't have 2 or 3 foreign policies. We can only have one. Everything's got to be integrated, and H.R. McMaster has to have oversight of that.
Should he get to pick his staff?
Absolutely. I think it's important that you get to pick staff, and what I would say is, Mr. President, you want to succeed. It is in your interest and mine that I pick the most talented people in America, even, by the way, if some of them signed letters that were critical of you as a candidate. I'm glad to say there are some very talented people who have gone in. On the economic side, Ken Juster, I just read the other day that Fiona Hill is going in to advise him on Russian matters, so they are beginning to attract some talent. But you need 75, 100 talented people working on the NSC, not just a handful.
Let's talk about another cabinet member. It's the scandal du jour, Jeff Sessions. Now, Jeff Sessions apparently had contact with the Russian ambassador during the campaign. He was a senator. He was on the Armed Services Committee. And then he denied those contacts in his sworn testimony before the Senate in confirmation hearings. Should Sessions recuse himself in your judgment?
My view is, at a minimum, he's going to have to recuse himself. There's going to have to be some kind of an independent investigation, and the president is ultimately going to have to answer a question. Why is he basically sustained what I would call an outlier position on Mr. Putin and on Russia? 99% of the foreign policy establishment sees Russia as a spoiler. It's used force to commit aggression in Europe. It committed war crimes, arguably, in Syria. It interfered with our election. It's trying to interfere with the French and German elections. Why is this president, from day one, indeed as candidate, over a year now, sustained a position that I would call either sanguine or benign about the Russian exercise of power? What accounts for that? And I think that's a legitimate question because, again, the president's position on Russia and that of several of his aides is outside the foreign policy mainstream. That doesn't mean it's wrong, but I do think he has to explain why it is he does not perceive Russia to be a threat when it is used force in ways that are inimical to American interests, when it doesn't respect the boundaries of American democracy, and why does he believe that he can persuade Russia to become a more responsible actor in Europe, the Middle East, and more broadly.
Shouldn't this have all been predictable? He made clear during the campaign he was coming in as a candidate opposing the foreign policy mainstream, opposing conventional thinking, saying continue the Cold War is crazy. It's reasonable for a new president to want to reset relations or seek friendlier relations with every country or any country.
Well, the question is the terms. The goal of foreign policy is not to be friends with people. It's to have relations with them based on behaviors on their part that we believe are not inconsistent with our interests. If we can have better relations with Russia because Russia is respecting certain rules of international relations, not to use force to change borders, for example, not to commit war crimes, then I'm in favor of better relations with Russia. So, but only if it reflects real changes. But I think you make a good point about Mr. Trump more broadly. He is a disruptor. He does look at the world and he says, American foreign policy has cost too much. There's been a very poor return on investment. I disagree profoundly with both those judgments. What we're spending on our foreign policy and defense policy as a share of GDP is much lower now than it averaged during the Cold War. We can afford guns and butter. Indeed, we need guns and butter. And I think Mr. Trump consistently underestimates the benefits of American foreign policy. Stability in Europe, stability in Asia, unlike the first half of the 20th century. The prosperity we've gotten from global trading relationships and our ability to invest and move around freely and openly. So I think he gets it wrong on both ends. And I think he also has a tendency to blame what we spend on foreign policy for our problems here at home. But let's not kid ourselves. The Iraq War may have been misguided, but you can't blame the Iraq War for what happened, say, the 2008 financial crisis. We failed to manage our own economy. So whether we were in Iraq or not, you can't blame what we did overseas for our shortcomings here at home, or you can't blame the terrible state of American infrastructure on what we were doing running around, say, in Afghanistan. We simply didn't have political consensus in this country to modernize our infrastructure. So my own view is the president ought to be more of a preserver about international arrangements that I believe that on balance have overwhelmingly supported American national interests. He disagrees. He's the president, so I think he goes out and makes his case, and people like me, where we agree, will support him, and where we disagree, we'll push back.
Churchill said that the key to Russia is what is in its national interest. I mean, where do you see that falling? You at one point dismissed Russia as a Burundi with missiles.
That wasn't me. That was Richard Pearl, a different Richard.
A different Richard. But you quoted him with...
I think Russia is not a comprehensive great power. You know, and Vladimir Putin's goal is not to make Russia great again. That would mean real political and economic reform. He doesn't want that to happen because he'd lose some of his monopoly of power. He wants Russia to be taken seriously as a great power. It really has only a couple of tools. It's got the military tool, the cyber tool, it's got oil and gas. So my view is we should be pushing back against the expansion of Russian power in Europe. We ought to be strengthening NATO. We ought to be prepared to do what we think we need to do in the Middle East. But I'm happy to have a serious dialogue with Russia. I don't think our goal should be to overthrow Mr. Putin. If that means reassuring him on that, let's reassure him on that. It's way premature to think about bringing countries like Ukraine or Georgia into NATO. We can say that. I think we should be open to treating Russia with respect. We should, for example, resume some of the traditional arms control dialogues. I want to have a developed relationship with them, but we shouldn't base the relationship on hopes that Mr. Putin will get up in the morning and demonstrate self-restraint. That's not who he is. So we have to push back, and that means strengthening NATO. I believe helping the people of Ukraine do more for their own self-defense and so forth.
Trump doesn't want to renew the START II treaty. He told Putin that. He wants to have a new arms race. I mean,
well, the last place I want to be spending lots of money is on nuclear arms. I think we do need to increase what we spend on conventional arms. We shouldn't, by the way, though, take the money out of the State Department account or out of discretionary domestic spending. One area I disagree with the president is I wish he wouldn't treat entitlement spending as somehow sacred and off limits. There's lots of things we can and should do to trim entitlement spending, and we can do it in a way that still takes care of those Americans who are dependent on Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security and disability. But we've got to adjust and amend all of those programs. So again, I think we can do what we need to do in national security, but also do what we need to do domestically.
Okay, we have a short time left, but let's talk about something you did say. You said that China was our most important relationship in the 21st century. Managing that relationship was key. Where are we headed there, and particularly with regard to North Korea? What are our options?
Well, China is going to be the defining relationship of this century. It's a very different 21st century if we have a cooperative relationship as opposed to a Cold War or worse. I would think we ought to pretty much try to clear the decks, not have a fight with them over Taiwan, not have a fight with them over trade, but rather try to cooperate with them on reining in the North Korean nuclear and missile programs. If China wants to help us, they have more leverage than anybody, given how most of North Korea's trade goes in and out over Chinese territory. So I would certainly work with China if they're willing to meet us halfway. If not, then we face some very difficult options, many of which involve the potential use of force against North Korea. And obviously that's uncertain in its results and risky in its potential consequences. But I've got to tell you, it's also extraordinarily risky to think that we would simply allow North Korea to take nuclear warheads and put them on missiles that can reach the United States. That is not a world we want to let to come about.
Well, China denies having any influence over North Korea, of course, but recently they suspended the importation of coal. I think they're engaged in talks with them, right, even as we speak.
China denies it has much influence. The answer is it has tremendous influence with North Korea. It's often somewhat reticent to use it because it actually is that old saw about France and Germany. I like Germany so much, I'm glad there are two of them. Well, that's how China, I believe, feels about the Koreas. They don't want to see a united peninsula that's close to the United States. We should have conversations with China to reassure them about the strategic future of that peninsula, but we shouldn't kid ourselves. In this world of disarray, in this daunting inbox, this is arguably issue number one for the next couple of years.
Well, I have a question for you, Richard Haass, because we're concluding, and the question is, how do we stop the trend toward further disarray in the world? I
believe the lodestar, the compass for American foreign policy has to change. In the Cold War, it was things like containment. Now it has to be that we have to get other countries to sign up to a set of rules that they are going to commit to managing all those things that go on inside their territory that in this age of globalization could affect others adversely. I call it World Order 2.0, this principle of sovereign obligation. This has to become the principle of American foreign policy, and we have to start the conversations with others, because either collectively we are going to manage globalization, or globalization and all of its manifestations, from terrorism to proliferation to climate change to you name it, is going to overwhelm us.
Trump seems headed toward the elimination of globalization.
Well, you can't eliminate it, you can push back against it, but again, we either ourselves work with others to contend with globalization, or the power of globalization will not respect closed American borders. Climate change doesn't respect borders. Infectious disease doesn't respect borders. Computer viruses don't respect borders. We have got to get serious about dealing with globalization. Can't do it unilaterally. We've got to do it collectively, but America has to lead. The lesson of history, and you know it, Jim, is the world doesn't self-organize. It takes American leadership to organize the world. We can't say we're America first. We've got to work with others. We've got to lead the way. We've got to show the way. If we do it, it will be not just a favor to others, it'll be the ultimate favor we can do to ourselves.
Sovereign responsibility. So Richard Haass, thank you so much for coming by.
Thanks for having me.
I'm sorry we have to stop because it's been wonderful. And thank you so much for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations in the digital age. I'm Jim Zirin. Take care and all the best.